recording as well. Oh, there we go. All right. Let's see. Sound. All right. Can I get a thumbs up? Can everybody see my screen? Robert, oh, good. Thank you, Robert. All right, very good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild and our monthly meeting for September. We are excited to have you as part of this virtual meeting today. Normally our meetings, if we're meeting in person, we meet at a local restaurant, and we have a brand new venue that we'll actually meet at in October. Our meeting's going to be October 13th. We're moving over to Casa Flores, which is a Mexican restaurant, and they have graciously offered to let us use their back room space, which is a little bit larger. We'll have a little bit more breathing room. They do ask that everyone purchase a dinner or meal or margarita or something along those lines. So we want to make sure to patronize them, especially as our hosts going forward. So we are excited. There we go. I'm going to mute Jenny. We are excited about meeting at this new venue, so keep an eye out for that. But we typically will do our social and dinner at about 5:45, then we get started at 6:30, and then we usually wrap up between 7:45 and 8 o'clock. So just some quick updates and news. We are recruiting for a director and director in waiting. So if you're interested in being a part of the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild board and all the exciting things that we have coming up in the next year, please reach out to us. You can email us and we'd be happy to kind of talk you through what we do. It's not a whole, I say this, it's not a whole lot of time, but we'd love to have more helping hands. We have some exciting things like a spring beekeeping class and another field day and so many different things that we have happening that we want to get going. So we'd love to learn if you would like to join us in that endeavor. So especially we want to thank our volunteers. We had two big events that gave us a lot of exposure in August. We had the pollinators exhibit with the San Joaquin Historical Society. So thank you to our volunteers that were there. We were the hit of the grand opening because of Paul bringing his observation hive. So thank you so much, Paul. We also had a very successful honey tasting with the Lodi Chamber of Commerce, and that happened on August 25th. Hopefully you saw the pictures on our Facebook group and page, and we were so excited to be a part of that. We did a honey tasting. We had our own bee rows so that people could learn about beekeeping and Big Valley Beekeepers Guild. So it took many, many hands and helpers that night to help us set up. So we really appreciated that. So something new for 2023, and we do want to thank, we have new members, Melissa and Bill Burdick, and they graciously donated these fantastic lapel pins. They're beautiful. If you haven't seen them in person yet, you'll need to join for 2023. And we're hoping that if you join for 2023, you'll get one of these pins. So we're excited to have those, and so thankful to Melissa and Bill for offering us such a great membership drive. So if you haven't heard, and actually I have mine on now, we have our first ever guild t-shirts. We have them right now in our hot little hands, and we had planned to have them at the meeting tonight in person, but obviously we're all virtual. So we will have them at our next meeting on October 13th. If you want to get one between now and then, feel free to email us, and we will, try to find a way, if we can, that's convenient to meet up with you maybe in town. And if you'd like to sponsor one of our meetings, let us know. For our Zoom meetings, it's $15, and we appreciate all the help that we can get when it comes to those. So that allows us to do a recording and to do their Zoom meetings like we are right now. We also are getting ready to plan our Christmas and holiday party. So if you'd like to host or help with that, we would love for you to connect with and contact Barbara. Barbara is our volunteer coordinator, and she is getting ready to plan that. So if you'd like to host or maybe help with that planning and setup, please get in touch with Barbara or any one of us. And looking ahead, what kind of things do we want to do in 2023? Do we want to do a spring bee class and field day? I'm thinking probably yes. We have our new monthly location, right? Meeting location, which is Casa Flores. And although I think we're getting pretty close to fall, I don't know if we're going to get a B class in for then, but who knows? Who knows what the future holds? And then I'd like to introduce both Paul and Dave Marson. If you guys want to unmute and say hi real quick. They are on our board of directors. We also have Mark Allen, but I don't think he could be with us tonight. So have them say hello.
Hello.
Hello, thank you. So tonight we have a very special guest speaker, and I want to thank Bob for filling in at the very last minute. And I say that because literally last week I called him out of the blue and said, hey, would you like to talk about feeding bees? And he graciously said yes. And we're excited to have him. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Bob, along with his wife, Suzette, owns and operates Blue Ridge Honey Company. You can find them on Facebook as well as online. They are in Lakemont, Georgia. And Bob actually began his commercial beekeeping career in Oregon back in the early 80s. And because of migratory beekeeping practices, he's managed bees. He's ended up managing the bees in 9 states. He was voted 2003 Beekeeper of the Year in Georgia. And he's also been president of the Georgia Beekeepers Association, the Northeast Georgia Beekeepers Association, and I know I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Bob, Macon County?
Macon.
Did I do Macon? It's one of those, like the West Coast, we always get it wrong. Oh my gosh. It's like Ville, it's Val, right? So Macon County Beekeepers Association in Franklin, North Carolina. You can visit his webpage, so make sure you bookmark this, blueridgehoneycompany.com. And definitely go in and like his Facebook page for his Blue Ridge Honey Company. You can also find that he has a great YouTube channel. I've been watching his videos for a while, and he has a whole series now on feeding bees. So what we're going to cover today is just the tip, right? And you'll be able to dive into his YouTube channel. Definitely subscribe, like the videos, and go back in and watch them again and again. So make sure you visit those pages. So with that, we're going to turn it over. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And there we go. And then we're going to go ahead, Bob, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Share my screen. Okay.
Yep.
And share. Okay, great. I think I've got it pulled off.
I think you got it. Excellent. So welcome, Bob.
Yes, ma'am. Let me make sure I get, okay. Does that look good to you?
Yes, looks
Feeding
great.
bees. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. When you mentioned Lodi, California, it caught my attention. As I told you, and the others don't know, I was actually born in California, born in Los Angeles, and spent a lot of time up in your area. My grandmother lived in Nevada City and Grass Valley, and for a little while I lived in Vacaville, which is on the other side of Sacramento. And when I lived in Oregon, we pollinated into California, took bees down into the Big Valley, as you call it, San Joaquin Valley. And my pollination contracts are down around Madera, which isn't far from you. And so it kind of, Lodi brings back a little bit of memories. Drove through it a lot of times on the old US highway there. I was in California, of course, before the interstates existed, so we had to kind of go up that way sometimes. But yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. We have some parallels here to you, and we have some huge differences. For one thing, you're very arid there compared to us, and we're quite humid and quite wet. You're probably not going to want to hear this, but we've averaged over 100 inches of rain for 5 years straight. And I can remember when I lived in LA, I think the average year was probably about 14 inches. I think you guys are probably below that right now. I'm not sure, but I feel for you. I understand how important water is out there in the West. In Southern Oregon, we had a fair amount of water, but we also had droughts there too. But out here, we just don't experience it. We get too much rain here. Honestly, it gets in our way. Many of our honey crops come at a time when it traditionally rains a lot. One big honey flow for us potentially is our sourwood flow in July. And believe it or not, I know this is going to sound crazy, but We get a lot of our rain in the summertime in the form of thunderstorms and just wet spells that come up out of the Gulf of Mexico, and they're very different than your neighborhood. But feeding is feeding, right? And let's see, let's move on to the next slide. Well, let me say something about this slide first. You can see on the left, there's some nuke boxes. We feed nukes with gallon buckets and 5-pound honey jars. And we use 1 and 2 gallon buckets on top of colonies. You can see both black and white. Black would absolutely be a horrible choice in your area. You definitely want to stick with white buckets. So I'm going to read each slide in case anybody's on a small device and can't read the print. I'll just read everything out loud so nobody misses anything. And actually, I've got to do something to get to all the print. I've got a lot of pictures blocking the print. Let's see if I can move this a little or so. I guess whoops, I can't. I'll see if I can stumble through it. A nectar flow or the provision of sugar syrup to a colony will increase the cleaning behavior, particularly stimulating older bees, and generally lead to a reduction in brood diseases. This is, I found this to be absolutely true. Now, this is from a research study, research paper, I should say, called Fat Bees, Skinny Bees by Doug Somerville. This is from Australia. Some of the older beekeepers that have been at this a while would recognize that title, Fat Bees, Skinny Bees. It really became quite the rage a couple decades ago when it came out. It's a 50-page small little booklet if you want to purchase it, or you can go online and download this research study. And if you're serious about keeping bees and keeping them healthy and keeping them up, so to speak, in a dearth period, this is absolutely worth reading. It's very good. And even though it's a few decades old, it's still very, very timely even today. Anyway, next slide. Why does, and I can't see, it's part of the print, it says, why does a nectar flow promote overall colony health? And most experienced beekeepers will recognize that during a nectar flow, a lot of issues seem to disappear. Things like European foul brood and chalk brood, which you guys might not see much chalk brood out there because it's so arid. Here where it's so humid, it can be a problem at times. European foul brood, chalk brood, other minor brood issues just seem to disappear in a nectar flow. And the question is, why is that? And I'd like to take a minute and explain what's going on, because it has a lot to do with some of the benefits that we can create by feeding bees. The first thing sometimes when I'm talking to a bee organization, I'll kind of play a trick question on them. I'll ask the group a question for a raise of hands, perhaps, and I'll ask, what's the favorite food of bees? And of course, everybody looks at me like I'm an idiot, because the obvious answer is honey, right? Well, that's actually not the right answer. That's incorrect. The favorite food of bees is actually fresh incoming nectar. And if you want to prove it to yourself during a major honey flow, just set a comb of honey against a tree in the bee yard and watch them completely ignore it until the honey flow is over. Then they'll get around to robbing it. So one thing we have to understand about fresh incoming nectar is that it's primarily sucrose. Many people don't realize that. And what the bees do to this fresh incoming nectar is they add 3 major enzymes. The major enzymes in honey are not inherent. They're not there automatically. The bees are actually adding these enzymes, and they all have a purpose. Now, some we are more familiar with than others. One, and the one that I think people are most familiar with, is invertase. Invertase is there to invert the sucrose into fructose and dextrose, because sucrose sugar is not soluble enough to be made a thick enough substance to not ferment unless heat is involved. And of course, the bees can't add extra heat. Maybe in your, make a bad joke here, maybe in your neighborhood right now, that wouldn't be an issue. It takes heat to get enough sucrose into syrup to make it thick enough not to ferment. But fructose and dextrose, of course, are more soluble, and the bees can easily get that thick enough. So invertase inverts that sucrose into fructose and dextrose. Another major enzyme is diastase. Diastase converts starch into sugar, so we can see the benefit of that. And the one that I'm most concerned with here, and which is most important for this talk is the addition of glucose oxidase. The purpose of glucose oxidase is that it produces gluconic acid in fresh nectar, and it will do so until it gets thick and the pH has dropped to an average of 3.9. It's what makes our honey acidic, and that condition is also part of what makes honey highly antimicrobial, antibacterial, and so on. And a byproduct of the production of gluconic acid is actually hydrogen peroxide. Many of us know that hydrogen peroxide is in our honey. To newcomers, that seems to be a little bit of a shock, but trust me, it's there. Raw honey has a fair degree of hydrogen peroxide present, and it's part of what makes honey kind of a magic medicinal product. For instance, when you put honey on a wound or a burn or a scratch or something like that, we're finding out that not only is it good, but it, in most cases, is probably better than something you can buy out of a pharmacy or even pick up at a hospital. In Europe, they picked up on this, and you can actually go into many pharmacies in the hospitals over there and find honey impregnated gauze and bandages and things like that. And when you put honey on your wound, although the pH has dropped to 3.9 and the production of gluconic acid has stopped, once it gets to that point, the fluids from your body will once again bring the moisture content of the honey up, and the salinity from your body will raise the pH. And as long as that enzyme glucose oxidase is intact, it will once again begin to produce more gluconic acid, hence hydrogen peroxide. And that's one of the magic parts of honey, is that it can be an ongoing producer of hydrogen peroxide. And I think that's probably what makes it so good. Well, so this hydrogen peroxide present really creates somewhat of an antiseptic condition in the brood nest, and that's part of a big part of what's making these brood issues disappear in a nectar flow. And you can actually do the same thing with a sucrose syrup flow. And here we go. I have to state sucrose syrup because feeding high fructose corn syrup does not accomplish that. In fact, it inhibits the production and the maintenance of hydrogen peroxide. And I'm missing a few words because of the way my screen is set up, but I'll try to read this and not mess it up. In a feeding trial conducted to determine the difference between feeding sucrose syrup and HFCH, which is short for high fructose corn syrup, it was found that on average, the colonies supplied with sucrose syrup built 7,916 centimeters of honeycomb, while the colonies supplied with HFCS only built 4,571 centimeters. The mean mass of bees supplied with HFCS was 4.65 kilogram, while those supplied with sucrose had a mean weight of 8.27 kilogram. So right off the bat, we see there's something going on. There's a huge difference between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose syrup, and that has to be understood as we move forward. And of course, you can download this study too. It's worth reading. This is just one quote out of probably about 12 or 14 pages of research, and it's kind of the highlight of that research paper. Now, this is just an overview of some of the differences between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose syrup. And at this point, I should say sucrose syrup, that's simply, to me, that just means cane sugar. To some up in the Northwest where they grow beets a lot, they can use beet sugar also. But colonies gain weight better with high fructose corn syrup. Colonies fed high fructose corn syrup swarm less than those fed sucrose syrup. Pure high fructose corn syrup 55 does not ferment easily. that is actually the high fructose corn syrup that most commercial beekeepers are using. When they buy it by the tanker load, that's most often what they're purchasing. When comparing solids, HFCS 55 and 42 are cheaper than sucrose syrup, although that's the difference is getting closer and closer because the high fructose corn syrup is going up in price these days. High fructose corn syrup is more stable in storage than sucrose. Okay, so now sucrose syrup is more stimulating than high fructose corn syrup. Colonies will rear more brood, draw foundation better, and are healthier on sucrose syrup, and bees live longer and colonies overwinter better when fed sucrose syrup versus HFCS. That's what we saw in the previous slide. And some of the slides going forward are going to be just some quotes from some research kind of proving all of this. So back to fat bees, skinny bees, Doug Somerville. White sugar is pure sucrose and thus emulates nectar. Glucose and fructose were found to be half as attractive to foraging bees as compared to sucrose. Again, sucrose is very stimulating, whereas high fructose corn syrup is not. You just want to put on some weight and you don't want any stimulation at all, high fructose corn syrup can be perhaps be your best bet. But there's some other problems with high fructose that we're going to talk about here too. This is what we buy here in Georgia, United Sugars. This comes out of Florida and Louisiana. Out west, you have C&H Sugar and some of the other producers out there. All it is just pure cane sugar. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about sucrose syrup. We make our own, and you can purchase it by the tanker load or in totes or barrels, but we like to make our own because when it's warm temperatures, especially like the temperatures you guys are experiencing now, it can ferment easily unless it's very, very thick. And as we learned earlier, you really can't get sucrose real thick unless you use a lot of heat. Now, this slide, I was given permission to use this slide by Lewis Bartlett at the University of Georgia. He's a friend of mine. He's works in the entomology department over there and gets involved in the bee lab quite a bit. And I'm going to explain what you're looking at here. At first, it might seem confusing. What this represents is the percentage of hydrogen peroxide found in the colony. The first column all the way to the left is showing the concentration of hydrogen peroxide in honey when the colony has not been fed anything. It's just honey. It represents the stores in the colony. And you can see what happens when a colony is fed high fructose corn syrup. The presence of hydrogen peroxide actually drops significantly. And this is a big deal because, again, that presence of hydrogen peroxide is a huge part of the bee's immune system. It's part of how they create a healthy environment. As beekeepers, eventually we all come to understand that unlike human beings that have their immune system entirely within their own system, bees do not. The cavity and the nest that they create actually has some properties that actually constitute part of their immune system. An example of this would be propolis. You know, they found Marley Spivak up there at the University of Minnesota has pretty much proven that the presence of a lot of propolis in a hive or a colony cavity promotes a pretty good degree of health. She's found that it lowers lots of propolis presence will lower the incidence of European foul brood, chalk brood, and even to some extent American foul brood. And if you're interested, just go online and type in Marla Spivak, University of Minnesota /propolis, and her studies will come right up. It's very interesting. For decades, actually maybe for a century, we've been trying to breed the propolis production out of our bees because we don't want that sticky mess in our colony. Come to find out, we've been making a huge mistake, that the presence of propolis is actually very important. And I'm starting to kind of try to push that in my outfit. I've been using Caucasian bees or introducing Caucasian genetics into my colonies over the last few years, and we're starting to get a fairly big degree of propolis in our colonies. And yeah, it's a mess. And yeah, I got it on my radio knobs and my steering wheel and on my bee suit that my wife threatens me with death if I dare put it in the washing machine with any clothes that belong to her, because propolis doesn't come out. But we found out it's a good thing. Anyway, I kind of got down a rabbit hole there, forgive me. But see what happens here when we feed sucrose syrup. The presence of hydrogen peroxide is actually greater than just the honey present in the colony. And now when we go to the slide to the right, what we're looking at is the difference between the hydrogen peroxide concentration in the brood, or near in very close proximity to the brood. In other words, the food that's right against or right connected to the food. There's kind of a blending between brood and food. And you can see that the bees are investing something into this production of hydrogen peroxide, because they're actually, there's a greater concentration really close to the brood, and they're doing that to create an antiseptic envelope around their brood nest. And now you can look across these graphs and again, see what happens when you have simply honey in the colony and you have simply corn syrup in the colony. And once again, you can see the big difference with feeding light. I have to add this, it's the feeding of light sucrose sugar syrup. When you're feeding light syrup, you're having a lot more of this enzyme activity, chemistry. The bees are adding a lot of this stuff more than they do when you feed thick sucrose syrup. So that's something important to remember. Also, if you're interested in seeing this slide again, I have a video out with Lewis talking about this exact subject. And I think it's simply titled, it's either titled high fructose corn syrup versus sucrose syrup, or the reverse, sucrose versus high fructose corn syrup. If you go to our YouTube channel, you can find that in there. Providing a steady but moderate amount of thin sucrose syrup will maximize the stimulation effect. Providing large volumes of thick syrup will significantly reduce the stimulative effect. This is just me. This isn't a quote of anybody else. This is just what I figured out over the decades. Been doing this for over 40 years, and it's not that I'm all that brilliant or all that smart, but after a while, some things just stick with you. You start to see patterns, and eventually you figure these things out. So, and Doug Somerville in Fat Bees and Skinny Bees says something along these lines too. What we're talking about here is the difference between, say, feeding with a hive top feeder where you dump 3 gallons in and it's gone in 3 days, compared to perhaps using a jar or a bucket with a few holes in the lid where it might take the bees a week or two to take the same amount of food down. That moderate rate of thin syrup will create and what I'm saying here is will maximize and extend the stimulation effect, whereas just dumping a lot of sugar syrup in quickly, and especially thick syrup, will significantly reduce the stimulation effect. So here we read, the provision of nectar continues to keep the brood area open and population replacement at a higher expanding level. This stimulus can be artificially created by the provision of sugar syrup. I should probably, I'm quoting Doug here, but it could be added in here, the provision of sucrose sugar syrup, because high fructose corn syrup does not accomplish the same thing. Now we're going to get into 2 pages out of a study from all places. It's an oddest place. This came from Bangladesh. Very interesting that these guys put this effort into this study over in Bangladesh. I wish they would have had the wherewithal to extend some of what they studied here, but in a nutshell, they were trying to figure out what happened in a colony when you fed thin syrup versus thicker syrup. And here they have 4 different concentrations, 1-to-1, which is commonly touted as a concentration of sugar syrup that you would feed a package or a nuke or something like that to build it up. Yeah, we do. And you can see the other 3, they get thinner and thinner. 1 part sugar to 1.1 part water, 1 part sugar to 1.2 parts water, 1 part sugar to 1.3 parts water. What I wish they would have been able to do is to extend these numbers all the way up to something thinner, like say 1.5 parts water to 1 part sugar, and then something very thick like 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. I think that would have been very interesting. But even from these 4 different concentrations, we're going to see a definite trend. It's very interesting. And something worth mentioning down here in red, I added, this is during a dearth period when they did this. There was absolutely nothing at all coming in over, I think it was about 5 or 6 weeks. Well, it says August, October up there. Yeah, it was a dearth period. Now I'm going to try to explain this. It's a little difficult to understand at first. What this represents, these concentrations you see like in the first column, T1, T1, T2, T3, and T4, representing the different concentrations of sugar syrup. And what we're looking at is the percentage of brood under the existing bees. In other words, if let's just throw out an example. If the bees were covering one full comb, then in the first box there we see eggs in the hive, 5.45% of that one comb had eggs in it. And the next column is 6.97 and so on. So in T1, we see eggs, larvae, and pupa. And if you add those all together, they would add up to the total amount of brood concentration or percentage that's under the existing bees covering comb. Look what happens. Look at the dramatic difference between T1 and T4. The 1.1, which is not thick by anybody's standards, but if you drop down just to 1.3 parts water instead of 1 point water, look at the huge difference in the amount of brood present, the percentage of brood under the existing bees. Now, I picked up on this a long, long time ago, about 40 years ago. Actually, in California is where I started to understand this concept. I would see people or beekeepers feeding their bees with those, you don't see them anymore, but 40 years ago, it was very common to use a 1 gallon metal tin, something like you'd see turpentine or something like that in. A lot of beekeepers were using those as feeders, and they would simply just put one 2-penny hole in the lid. They weren't trying to gain weight as much as they were just trying to keep their bees a little bit stimulated so they didn't go completely flat during what can be a really extended dearth period in your state. I would see this in the bottom of the valley, and along where I first saw it was along Highway 99. There would be a lot of bee yards close to the road there, and I kept seeing these gallon cans in the middle of summer, wondering what these guys were up to. And eventually I learned that all they were trying to do is just one hole in that can to provide just a little bit of stimulation of very thin syrup. And at that time, that really high fructose corn syrup was available and present, but the beekeepers really hadn't switched over to it in a big way. Most of these guys were using sucrose, and they knew if they did that, they could keep their colonies from going completely broodless in the long dearth period in California in mid to late summer. So these are very interesting numbers to me, and I found it to be absolutely true. This is before I even found that study that had been done in Bangladesh. This is what I was putting in my talks and my PowerPoints to show people. And I still pretty much, I'm using the exact same chart that I did 5 years ago when I'd speak to bee clubs. And I'll read it out loud in case anybody can't read it well. These are sugar syrup ratios that we use. 1 part sugar to 1.25 or 1.5 parts water is best for brood and comb building without gaining excessive weight. Highly stimulating and it elicits hygienic behavior. This is important to know. Thick syrup does not elicit hygienic behavior. And this goes back to a nectar flow. A nectar flow of thin sucrose nectar really elicits a high degree of hygienic behavior. This is also part of what's cleaning up the brood issues that we might see before the honey flow starts. 1 part sugar to 1 part water is really good for building colonies. Like if you get a nuke or a package and you've got to not only stimulate brood rearing and wax building, but you actually have to gain some weight too. That's where something like 1-to-1 would come in, where you're trying to build a colony from a package into perhaps a good stout, 2-story colony that has plenty of stores on it. And then of course, 1.5 or 2 part sugar to 1 part water would for us in Georgia is good for late summer, fall feeding when we have to put on weight in a short amount of time before winter sets in. We do have a degree of winter here. It's colder here than it is where you're at. Where I actually live in the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains. A lot of folks don't realize that the mountains actually extend into the state of Georgia a little ways, and that's where we live. And we do actually have a winter, and the bees do go broodless in winter. I think in Lodi, depending on the race of bee, you might not go entirely broodless in Lodi, but here we absolutely do for probably 3 or 4 weeks each winter. Okay, now back to fat bees, skinny bees. As you can see, I like this research study. I quoted a lot, and again, it's really worth reading. Old syrup may look okay, but the rising yeast cell content will have a significant deleterious, if I'm pronouncing that right, effect on adult bees, leading to premature death of field bees. Now, this is especially important in your neighborhood because of your temperatures. In winter temperatures that drop below 50 degrees, this isn't a problem. Syrup and honey too, when you get into temperatures below 50 and 40 degrees, is fairly stable. You get into these warmer temperatures, and the warmer it gets, the quicker things deteriorate, and sugar syrup deteriorates too. It's real tempting to mix some sugar syrup and not use it all and save the rest till 4 or 5 or 6 months later when you suddenly need it. And if it's been kept in the temperatures that I'm hearing that you guys are experiencing in California, I would be very careful about that, because your syrup may not be very good food anymore. Now, this isn't a problem in your area because your bees have a lot of opportunity for cleansing flights in the winter. But in places like Minnesota, Montana, Michigan, where bees can't get out, this is an issue. Dark honeys, which are high in minerals, are harder on bees than light honeys. When bees face long periods without cleansing flights, very dark honeys, which contain many ingredients, which contain many indigestible solids, can nearly be a death sentence. Again, this is not a problem in Lodi. You may get incidents of, you may get a honeydew flow at times there, maybe off of white oaks, I'm not sure. We used to get a honeydew flow off of white oaks in Southern Oregon in August into September, sometimes all the way to frost. And I know you guys have a lot of white oaks, so I don't know if you get that or not. Now, what's important about this? Let me see. Okay, what's important about this? If you're in a northern climate where the bees can't get out and take cleansing flights, it's actually advantageous to take all of the honey away in some situations and feeding them back sucrose syrup, because they don't have any indigestible solids. And like if you watch some of these guys in Canada that overwinter in barns for 4 or 5 months and the bees don't get a cleansing flight, or in some northern states where they might only get 1 or 2 flights in 2 or 3 months, they have much better luck overwintering on straight sucrose syrup than they do honey. And of course, the lighter honeys are better. And of course, crystallized honeys don't do as well as something that stays liquid. So there's a lot of chemistry going on here. Anyway, this is interesting information, perhaps not for you guys, but it's just interesting to know. Now, I'm going to read this and then talk about George Emery here a second. I wish someone would explain to me the opposition or resistance of the average beekeeper to feeding his bees sugar syrup. It has been proven, not guessed, that sugar syrup is a better winter food than honey and never causes any gut problems to a bee that some honeys do, particularly fall honeys. Now, George was a Maryland beekeeper, so he had fairly cool winters. He also, for older beekeepers, was the man who invented the emery shim. You'd have to go back a few decades to remember that one, but they actually sold them in some of the bee catalogs, and they were called an emery shim. It was about a 1 or 1 1/4 inch high shim that he had an entrance in, and he would put those shim boards in between honey boxes, any place in the colony. I think he usually put them between the brood nest and the honey supers to create not only an extra entrance, but a place where bees could cluster. And he was a proponent of the idea that this helped with swarming a lot. And I think he was probably correct. Of course, it made a lot of burr comb in the middle there and stuff, but which was a drawback, but it really kind of was good for the bees. Now, if you want to, this guy was pretty colorful and pretty direct. You can tell by this statement that he had no problem telling people what he thought. it's really worth going to this site, George Emery's Pink Pages. There's a lot of really good information. He was a true master beekeeper, someone who really had mastered the trade, and he had a lot to say, and it's worth going to those pink pages. And you can just Google George Emery's Pink Pages and it comes right up. Okay, again, this is a northern thing more than a southern thing, but it is not okay to feed molasses, sorghum syrup, maple syrup, fruit juice, Karo syrup, brown sugar, unrefined sugar, or powdered sugar, which contains starch. I should add to this that means organic sugar too, because organic sugar is pretty much unrefined. All of this stuff has compounds and substances in it that are not very digestible. And again, if the bees can't get out and defecate often and real often with things like molasses and maple syrup, it really can cause problems like dysentery and other problems. This picture on here kind of shows how we feed smaller colonies with 5-pound honey jars. That's almost a blast from the past. I picked up on that 40 years ago and just kind of held on to that concept. These jars are very expensive now. I have quite a few that I bought decades ago when they weren't so bad. Now they're nearly $3 a piece, but they really are a pretty neat jar for feeding with, and I use a lot of them. This picture, completely different subject. This picture is showing how I overwinter small colonies on top of a double screen board off of a stronger colony below. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go to the YouTube channel also. Now we're getting into the mechanics rather than the chemistry of feeding. And before I go further, I have to say, this is how we do it. This is not necessarily the best way for the viewers. It may not be the best way for anybody, but I found it to be what works best for us. So I have to be careful here for brand new beekeepers, I think it's important that you glean all the information that you can from speakers that come to bee clubs like this and the bee magazines and the books, and really try to be smart about things and try to figure out what works best for you. Again, this is what works best for me, although it may not be what's best for you. We use a lot of 1 and 2 gallon buckets, and we put a plug in the top to feed. And I'm just going to show the mechanics of how we put these things together and make them for anybody that has a little shop and wants to do their own work. I think this is a picture of a 2 gallon bucket. We put a 2-inch, what's called a tint plug in the lid after drilling that hole. Tint plugs are not found everywhere. You can't just go down to the hardware store and buy them. You can go online and simply search for 2-inch tint plugs, and some things will come up. I sell them in my store in smaller quantities. When you go online, usually they're trying to sell you 2,000 or 3,000 in a case. If you're in, and I'm not trying to be a salesman and promote us, but I just want to mention it because you can get these in smaller quantities from us. Just call our store. Our phone number is on our website, and you can talk to the retail girls. And if you just want 20 or 50 of these, you can order them from us. They're 50 or 60 cents each, I think, something like that. Anyway, we drill 1/16 of an inch holes in these things. That's also a good size hole to put in anything that you're feeding with, whether it be a jar lid or you're drilling into the top of the bucket itself, whatever. 1/16 to me is the preferred hole. And when you're using plastic, you need to use a drill because you have to remove the plastic. Whereas if you're using a metal lid, you can use a small nail and poke a hole, and the metal just kind of bends aside and doesn't close back and close the hole. But with plastic, you have to use a good sharp drill bit to remove that plastic. Now, I'm also going to talk a moment about how many holes for what purpose. In this picture, I showed 10 holes for fall feeding. This would be when we're trying to put weight on fairly rapidly. A 2 gallon bucket of 1-to-1 syrup on top of a strong double deep colony with 10 holes, they will take that bucket down in about 7 days. Now, if you're trying to meter out the feed over a period of time, it's real simple. Just only have 3 or 4 holes open. You can actually use the same plug, or even if it's the bucket lid. Oddly enough, if you just close some of those holes with beeswax, the bees don't remove the beeswax. So you can take 10 holes and turn it into 3 or 4 just by putting a little, pushing in a little wad of wax into the hole. Very easy to do. If you want to buy these stainless steel plugs, or a plug with a stainless steel wire embedded into it, you can order those from Better Bee in New York. And of course, that's a big supply house there in New York State. And I don't know if those prices are current. This may be an older slide. I think I've had it a year or two, but those work too. Of course, being that stainless steel screen, they'll take it down much quicker than they will than if you're trying to meter it with just a few holes. Now, this is how we put the hole in the lid. We just use what's called an adjustable circle cutter. You can go online and order those from any industrial catalog. You might be able to find them down at your local Ace Hardware store. And what we're doing is we're putting, and well, let me back up. I guess I didn't have that written there. It's a 1 5/16 inch hole to accept a 2-inch tint plug if you're trying to do this. And the hole has to be just a little bit smaller than the plug. And we also put holes in our lids. We use migratory flat lids, whereas I'm guessing that some of you may have telescoping lids with an inner cover, and I'll address that in a moment. If you're just using a flat lid like most migratory commercial beekeepers do, we put a 71 millimeter hole in the lid, which is the perfect hole to accept the lid from a quart jar or a 5-pound honey jar. And if you want to feed with a quart jar through the lid, order yourself a 71 millimeter hole saw, and you can accomplish that. And when I say jig to hold the piece firmly in place, I mean it. This is a big hole saw that lid can dance around, and you need a pretty good drill press to do it too. If you try to do this with a smaller handheld drill, it's hard to keep that hole really precision because the drill wants to dance around on you a little bit. So the combination of a jig and a drill press is your best bet for getting a real precision hole. And if you're worried about rainwater, again, I guess you guys aren't worried about that as much as we are, but here you just put a canning jar ring in that hole, which is, again, fits a standard quart jar. And when the water seeps underneath the bucket, it hits that little lip on that ring and it just wanders around the ring and goes out the other side. It's a non-issue. We use one piece metal 70 mm or 70G lids to accomplish all this. We actually use a solid lid as a cork. A solid cap has a cork in our bee lid when we're not feeding. And that's just a 2-penny nail on the end of that stick. And we might, on our very small nucs, we might only choose to put one hole in those lids. Whereas with a large nuc, we might put 2 or 3 or 4. A 2-penny hole in a jar lid, if you can keep that jar consistently full of thin syrup, you can draw foundation out in a nuc or a single with as little as 3 holes. 4 definitely will draw foundation. And by the way, we have drawn a bunch of foundation out on thin syrup. It works just fine. This year, we probably drew 500 deep boxes out of plastic foundation on nothing but thin sugar syrup, no honey flow at all. And it actually is cost effective. I've done the math, and the value of what you have after you've drawn it out with sugar syrup actually is greater than the cost of the sugar syrup, as long as you're willing to do the labor. This is a picture of the 5-pound honey jar that we use. And that's just an example of how we feed nucs in one of our queen mating yards with these 5-pound honey jars. Each jar in this picture probably just has 1 hole in it. We also use these division board feeders. You have a company in California up there that makes them called Mother Load Plastics, I think, makes a good inside feeder like this. This particular one is from Man Lake. I'm a Man Lake dealer, so I get a good deal on them. So of course I'm going to use Man Lake. I think Man Lake has a dealer, has a outlet now in California, if I'm not mistaken. So we can get them there too.
They're about an hour and a half away from us. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty good.
It's a good feeder. Now, again, we use the 1.5 gallons. That, in my opinion, is what fits best with 8 frames in a 10-frame box. A 2 gallon feeder will work, but it makes it real tight. And then a 1 gallon feeder is too small, at least too much space with 8 frames, and it's again too tight with 9. So we feel like the 1.5 gallons is the right size. I have them, I use them. There's a time and a place where they're really the preferred feeder for us. But that if we're going back to that stimulative effect and that hygienic effect and all of that, this feeder is not your best bet, because a good strong colony will empty that 1.5 gallons in 1 or 2 days, as compared to a bucket with maybe 3 or 4 or 5 holes that might take, 7 to 10 or even 14 days to empty. But this is legitimate. You want to put a lot of weight on fast, or if you're migrating, I don't do this anymore, but I used to migrate all over the place. I sent bees to California as late as 3 or 4 years ago, as recent as 3 or 4 years ago. And every colony that went to California had one of these feeders in it. So the feeder was always with the colony, and there's a huge advantage to that. But on my stationary colonies that never move, I don't have these feeders in there. I just use buckets. Okay. Oh yeah, there's a good picture of that feeder. And again, I'm not sure if that's a current price or not. Man Lake. Just a picture of us feeding, hive or division board feeders in each colony. These were migratory colonies that were down in South Georgia, and they were destined to be double stories. So I don't mind putting those feeders in a double story 10 frame colony. I don't make a habit of putting them in singles. That only leaves 8 frames behind. So what you see in this picture isn't my normal habit. We do occasionally add additives to our syrup. You have to be careful with this stuff. If you were to use Honeybee Healthy in your sugar syrup right now during, you guys must have a dearth, am I correct? Yeah, if you put this Honeybee Healthy or Pro Health in your syrup right now, you can cause a robbing frenzy, because this is so highly attractive to the bees. In some cases, it just drives them nuts, and they're trying to get in the cracks and the crevices of every colony you fed. Especially even if you have those inside feeders like that Man Lake feeder I showed, the bees don't have access to it from the outside, but they know it's in there. They can smell it. And you got to be careful with this stuff when you feed it. So although it can be healthy for your bees and it will help your sugar syrup from fermenting in warm weather, you got to be careful when you feed it. And I guess I could talk about fermenting syrup for a moment right here. That is one advantage to high fructose corn syrup that has not been thinned down yet, is that it is more stable and much less likely to ferment than sucrose syrup. That's one of the disadvantages to sucrose syrup. And that's why we make our own as we go. We don't buy tanker loads of sucrose syrup. We have a big mixing tank, and I do have a video if you're interested in that on the YouTube channel. I think it's simply How We Mix Sugar Syrup, I think is the title to that. And we feed out of totes. We'll put 1 or 2 totes of syrup on a truck, and we have a pump and kind of do it that way. And if you use Honeybee Healthy or Pro Health in your sugar syrup, it won't ferment. And but if you're unable to do that because it's a dearth period, and this is going to sound appalling, and stick with me for a moment till I get through the whole explanation, but most commercial beekeepers I know put 1 teaspoon of bleach per gallon, and that will inhibit the fermenting for long enough to where the bees can take it down before it ferments. Now, Randy Oliver, whom is in your neighborhood up there, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with, did a little research study on that. And that's actually where I got that recipe, 1 teaspoon per gallon, which if you're doing a drum comes to at about a cup per drum. He actually did that and fed and found that it just had absolutely no negative effect on his bees. In fact, he kind of, from his research study, it sounded like he kind of liked using it because it kind of inhibited the growth of mold and algae and stuff in his jars. And his opinion was it's quite all right. He also stated that after you mix up your sugar syrup, if you were to take a chlorine test strip and put it in your sugar syrup, 8 hours later, it would detect 0 chlorine. So it really kind of dissipates fast. It does its work and kind of dissipates, I suppose, a lot like our city water might do. This is the last slide. And this is simply suggested viewing for more info. If you find this subject interesting, these are some of my videos that talk more about this same subject. You can get more detailed information. Some of these videos are 30 minutes long, and so I kind of skipped over some of the fine points in this talk. And let's see, I'll leave that up while we talk in case anybody's writing any of that down. And that is the end of my presentation. So I'd be glad to answer any questions that there might be. How are we doing on time?
Hey, we're doing great on time. Let's
Okay.
see. Let me go through. I'm going to go through our chat. We've had a couple of questions coming in. Some of them you might have already answered in the presentation, but I always think it's good to repeat a couple things, especially because right now everyone's brains are probably swimming. They're trying to absorb and digest everything that you shared. And
Yeah, I know that's kind of
a lot to take
information
in.
overload in 45 minutes. But again, everything I said, every slide I just showed is in one of these videos.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. Okay, I'm scrolling down. Okay. So this one I think is maybe more for the group, but maybe you have a perspective, especially being in Georgia. So how hot is too hot to open a hive, especially if he just wants to.
I was listening to that little conversation you were having, and first off, I'll say, how cold is too cold to open a colony? And I think hot would fall in the same category, oddly enough. And if I like to compare colonies to human beings, and I know that sounds crazy, but a lot of what makes us comfortable and makes a colony comfortable are really pretty close to the same thing. And so here's what I say when somebody asks me, how cold is too cold to open a colony? I say, you can walk to the mailbox if it's 10 degrees and you can get back, and you might not like it and it might feel bad, but it's not going to hurt you. You're not going to get sick and you're not going to freeze to death. You just don't want to hang out in the front yard at 10 degrees in your t-shirt. Right. And it's the same thing with a beehive. You can open a beehive at 10 degrees and look inside. You just don't want to leave it open. And I think it would be the same thing with the heat. Can you open a beehive at 110 degrees? I think absolutely you can. You just don't want to leave it there very long, because then they can overheat. They create these drafts inside a colony. They have air movement, and water has to be extremely important in this equation, in this heat, especially in your arid area. They're using water evaporation as a cooling device. And they have these airflows going through the colony. They figure it out, and they know where to push air in, and they know where to pull it out and evaporate water along the way. And if you open a lid or crack a box, you disrupt that whole thing for a minute or two. So maybe a minute or two is okay, but if you leave it there very long, that's when you can have a colony overheat. I don't know if that answers the question. I'm saying, yes, you can, just don't make a habit of it. Right. Don't do it if you don't have to do it. And if you do, don't do it very long. Yep, exactly. No, I think that's great advice. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Next one. Because you do so much honey bottling, any suggestions on maybe what to use to clean or sanitize new plastic bottles for bottling honey? Any suggestions on that from the honey side? Well, that's actually a good question, and the answer is actually somewhat alarming to many people. We purchase a lot of plastic containers, and like we get most of our plastic from Gamber Container in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They're actually the ones that have that 5-pound jar manufactured. That's their mold. Gamber Container is actually the first company to invent the honey bear, interestingly enough. Bill Gamber, or I think his name was Bill, back in the 50s, invented the honey bear. Anyway, little history on Gamber Container. Those containers are supposed to be cleaned as they're manufactured, and as long as the box hasn't been opened and they're in that plastic bag and it's wrapped and not been torn open, they should be relatively clean. But here's something, and this is not just me saying this. This is our inspectors telling me the same thing. We store all of these containers in a pretty type warehouse, but it is a warehouse. It's not a sanitary, sterile environment. And they consider honey to be what they call a safe food. In other words, you don't have to have a sterilized container to put it in, because it will somewhat sterilize the container itself, as long as the honey is cured properly, isn't going to ferment and do all that. And I go along with that theory. I think that if your honey hasn't been overheated, you have this hydrogen peroxide present, and even if it has been overheated and you bottle hot, you're neutralizing a lot of bad things that could be in there. So I'm dancing around my real answer, which is that we don't do anything. We just keep it clean from the factory and we go from there. And we have some real serious inspectors. I mean, it's not just the state. We get inspected in a very serious manner, and they're all quite happy with what we do.
Wow, very good, very good. How about when it comes to single deeps? I know that in your presentation, you talked about this just for a second. Do you overwinter your hives as single deeps ever at all?
Absolutely. You can overwinter them anywhere in the country as long as they're handled properly. The real advantage there's two advantages to having something larger than a single story. One is the amount of food you can stuff in there and still leave the bees a place to actually rear some brood. And like right now, I'm about to put this in a video actually. Right now, we're starting to feed our colonies in preparation for winter. And I'm telling people to be careful that right now we have a goldenrod bloom happening, which is a good pollen source for us just before fall. And it's just starting. It'll go for about 2 or 3 weeks and then it'll be over. So during this period right now today, we need to feed, and we're feeding this thin syrup like I just described to stimulate the bees, create this hygienic behavior and all this chemistry we discussed. But I'm cautioning people not to overfeed and constrict the brood nests so that the bees don't have ample place to rear brood. Mm-hmm. And with a single, that's a little trickier. Whereas with a double deep, we can start to feed away right now. A double deep always seems to have a place to stick 2 or 3 or 4 gallons and still have plenty of places to rear brood. So that's one of the differences. Of course, a single will always overwinter. Okay, I got to be careful. It's a generalization. This is a general statement, not always correct. That a single will generally overwinter with less bees in a smaller cluster than a double deep, simply because they had less space to rear brood going into fall. And but that's not necessarily a horrible thing. In Lodi, California, unless you're going to pollinate almonds or make strong colonies for shaking packages early or something like that, you don't need 14 frames of bees going into winter to survive winter. 5, 6, 7 frames of healthy bees with a good queen and well-fed and relatively mite-free or mites reduced should overwinter in your neighborhood just fine. So I don't know if I'm answering the question. I might be dancing around it, but we have no problem with single-story colonies. I prefer double deeps because they're easier to split. They don't starve as much. They don't swarm as early, but I prefer singles in that they're much easier to manage, easier to find the queen and things like that. They both have their pros and cons. Do you think I answered the question? I'm not sure.
No, I totally think you did. That was
great. I asked the question because I saw one of your slides. You had a bunch of singles that had feeder jars on them, but that was probably some other intermediate step, something else.
Well, I'm going to be talking my next video, which probably won't come out for another week. I'm talking about that subject exactly, just how many frames of brood you want in a single right now, and what does it take to make it through winter and things like that.
Very
so
good.
Watch for that.
So we have another question also from Paul. He said, there's a lot of beekeepers that are absolutely against feeding hives, saying that it's not good for the bees. And of course, after watching your videos and hearing, the different studies and the information that you have, obviously maybe the actual opposite might be true. So how do you handle those situations when someone has an opposing view about feeding bees, and how often do you find that?
I run into it from time to time. Just 2 years ago, I was sitting in at at a state beekeeping meeting here in the Southeast, and I listened to a prominent speaker that was very well known in his region and recognized as being an expert. And he got up there and told everybody that feeding your bees was absolutely a mistake, that it would make them lazy, sickly. And there's three big things he touted: lazy, sickly, and there was, anyway, that's the general idea. I was sitting in the back row. I wanted to say it. My brain was going, no. And it's absolutely, of course, I don't often say this. I always like to say everybody has, their opinion, and that it's legit for whatever reasons they have it for. But in this case, if you're using sucrose syrup, that's absolutely untrue. So how do I deal with it? I either keep my mouth shut, or in this instance, I let the slides do the talking.
Yeah.
In my YouTube videos, I really try to quote what I would consider experts or researchers, so people aren't just thinking I'm trying to make out like I'm the expert and the last word on things. And that's what I did in this presentation. I tried to quote people that are really recognized as experts in the industry. And I would you agree that what we presented here kind of points to the idea that that's absolutely incorrect?
Exactly.
I asked that question, and my response now is going to point them to the I'm going to find a study that Emory did that I think you mentioned, and I'm going to point them to that, or send them a link, or educate them.
Mm-hmm.
Go to, on the screen, you'll say, is feeding sugar syrup good or bad for bees? That's actually an old video of mine, but I think it does a pretty good way of stating this case. And then feeding bees part 1, although it's long and a little bit boring, that's where I got the slides for George Emery and some of those others that I, that was stating fact. So those two are pretty good to steer people toward. Hey, and you know what? I don't want to argue with people. There's no debate. I mean, if that's what they're firmly believing, I'm not going to argue with them. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
There really is something to that. If you believe something's true, some cases it might just be better. If you believe it hard enough, it's going to make it work, right? Kind of a mental, I don't know how to describe that, metaphysical. If you believe something, maybe it works because you believe it so much, and that's okay too.
The power of mental thought. I don't know. There's something about that. I can't remember what that is. That's all right.
It truly is. Yeah. We have to recognize that.
We do. Well, so you had talked a bit about rationing how much of that feed syrup the bees are getting, and talked about how many holes you might need in your canning jar lids. So one question was, if I'm using a 1/2 gallon canning jars to feed syrup, how many holes should I punch in the lid? And what I took from your presentation was it depends on the time of year and what the bees are doing.
Well, the time of year, how many bees are in the colony, and how large of a cavity it is. Is it a double deep? Is it a single? And the time of year, what are you trying to accomplish? If you're trying to put on weight for winter in a single story colony, you might be wanting to use 5 or 6 holes. If you have a small 2 or 3 frame nuke, that'd be a case where you'd want to use 1 hole. Maybe you're trying to draw out foundation in the spring. Maybe you want 6 or 8 holes. So there really is an equation to this thing. Yeah.
Got it. And then is your sugar syrup ratio, the actual sugar syrup, is it by weight or volume?
It doesn't matter, because interestingly enough, sugar and water weigh very close to the same. Like a quart of sugar and a quart of water are very close to the same weight.
Oh, interesting.
So you could use 5 pounds to 5 pounds, or 1 quart to 1 quart, and you'd really be accomplishing very close to the same thing.
Okay. And how about when it comes to pollen patties? Should those be provided at the same time or when you're also providing light syrup?
They can be, if you're an advocate of using pollen supplement. I like to say there's no such thing as a pollen substitute. I don't think they got that figured out yet. There's some pollen supplements that can do a good job of raising bees, but I like to say that nothing replaces Mother Nature. But if you are using pollen substitute supplements, whatever you want to call it, the addition of sugar syrup really is helpful, and vice versa. something to understand that the creation of all these enzymes in sugar syrup takes a little bit of proteins. And I gotta write that down in one of these slides for next time. I need to remember to state that. We like to really feed sugar syrup when there's at least a little bit of pollen coming in. And right now with this goldenrod pollen coming in is the absolute best time for us to do it, because fresh pollen is the most stimulative things that bees can experience for raising brood. It stimulates more than thin syrup. It stimulates even more than a nectar flow. Fresh pollen will get the bees rearing brood when nothing else will. And so if you can create, I'm getting off the subject of pollen substitute, but if you're trying to give them protein for rearing brood, the addition of sugar syrup helps. And also when you're feeding sugar syrup, if you have zero protein coming in, there's no pollen in the comb, there's no pollen coming in, a little bit of protein in the form of a pollen substitute or supplement can be helpful. Now, you guys are blessed in California in one way, in that you don't have the hive beetle problem we do. If we put a pollen patty in there at this time of year, it's going to get absolutely slimed. It's going to create the biggest mess, grossest mess you've ever seen. We can't use pollen patties right now. We even in winter, we have to be careful. We put in half patties and smaller pieces in small colonies, or they'll get slimed. The colonies need to be able to eat it up in just a matter of days, or the hive beetles just have to create terrible havoc with it. You guys don't have that problem.
It's interesting because in the last couple of years up in the Grass Valley area or El Dorado, Placerville area, they have had more issues with hive beetles recently. But
Really?
what about dry pollen? Does that create the same problem?
No, that's legit. And I've never done it, but I've watched other people put dry pollen feeders outside. And when there's a true dearth, the bees will go after that and collect it. And so that's legitimate, especially in late winter when they're trying to begin to rear brood, but they have no protein in the colony. They'll take weird stuff like cow feed and sawdust and all kinds of weird stuff. So they'll really go after it at that time of year.
So in your experience, have you found that there's a difference maybe in the dearth periods between, say, a city or urban environment, or maybe country, more rural environments?
Well, I haven't experienced it personally, but I've listened to other people talk about getting minor sources of pollen in the suburbs or the cities that don't exist in the country. In other words, potentially having a more diverse pollen flow in the city because of the ornamentals. Now, I don't know about California, but down in Atlanta, Georgia, there's a lot of things growing in the city that are putting out pollen in summer or other times that don't exist in the country. Yeah. Now we're okay with I actually am okay with a dearth period. Our dearth period starts in late July and runs through late August. It lasts about a month, 3 weeks maybe. That I also use that time period, and you couldn't get away with this in your temperatures. But I also use that time period to treat with Apiguard, which is that thymol-based gel, and which shuts the queen down somewhat anyway. Our bees were shut down for 10 days to 2 weeks. Either the queens weren't laying anything, or they were laying minor amounts of brood from a combination of Apiguard and no pollen coming in. So the Apiguard treatment is just been over about a week ago, and now our pollen is starting to come in, and the bees look absolutely brilliant because it's just like they're rearing brood for the first time. They went broodless, so you see all these beautiful brood patterns. There was nothing in the way when the queen kicked back in, and it's really something to see. It looks like the colony's starting off fresh in the spring.
Wow, very good. And actually there was, go ahead.
Oh, you probably have a more extended dearth period than just 3 weeks, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it typically, it can run in my particular microclimate. It can be anywhere from, I'd say typically around 2 months.
Oh
Like
my,
it's a
yeah,
long dearth, but every year is different. That's part of
yeah,
the trick to it, right?
it's Mother
Um,
Nature. Yeah.
mhm. And here's another question. So good timing when you're talking about the mite treatments. Is it a good idea to feed thin syrup while your mite treatments are on, or does it depend on what you're treating with?
Well, it could depend on what you're feeding, but we feed through, okay, if you're trying to if you're trying to allow your colony to shut down, like in the instance of using ApiGuard, and I actually consider that little brood shutdown a good thing. It's really good for mite suppression. I wouldn't necessarily feed thin syrup at that time. If the colony was light, that might be an occasion when I would prefer using a inside man lake feeder and just dump a gallon and a half in there, perhaps even some thicker syrup, so I'm not actually stimulating brood rearing. If I was using Apivar or something like that that doesn't shut the queen down and I wanted her to continue to lay, absolutely I would feed thin syrup. And I've done lots of that in the past, right through an Apivar treatment or something like that. I just feed at the same time. And I do feed with thymol on too, but not necessarily thin syrup.
Got it. Now, if somebody does use an inner cover, can they just invert a 2-gallon bucket like
Yeah.
over the top? Yeah, they can go
Yeah,
ahead
I
and look
should,
at
that's something else I got to remember to address. And I even hit upon it for a moment and then forgot.
it. That's
Yeah,
okay.
it's really good. An inner cover is really a great way to do it. Just make sure the notch is down. If you have a ventilation notch, they can be on, there's like that little notch on the top. Turn it down against the colony, put the bucket over the upper hole in the inner cover and cover it with a deep super. And then put your telescoping cover on top. And that'll keep the rain and any bugs or other bees or whatever out of that inside. That's why you put the notch down. Yeah, it's actually better than what we do with the hole in the lid. It's just that it takes extra equipment and extra labor, so we don't go that direction.
Right. Is there a difference between cone sugar and sugar beet sugar? Wait.
There is. I not got this completely figured out. I know that beet sugar tends to be GMO, but I've also heard people, and I'm going to get in trouble real fast here because I don't exactly know what I'm talking about. But the GMO apparently is not a problem when it comes to sugar because something about the protein and some of the things, it's not GMO related. In other words, it's the same in both a GMO and a non-GMO. And again, I don't know enough. I got to get that down so I can answer that intelligently. The short answer is that many people believe that beet sugar and cane sugar will accomplish the same thing.
Oh, got it. Okay. Let's see. Debbie had asked a question about during hot weather, is it okay to use the hive feeder that's in, the in hive feeder full of water? And I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I say it can be, but I have to admit I've never done it. But what I do know works is having a Boardman feeder on the entrance with a jar, like a,
with water.
Yeah, with water in it. Yeah, with that Boardman feeder on the front with a jar in it, and the bees take it down. They use it. So I would guess that an inside feeder might be effective, but I would I wouldn't do it to 100 colonies. I might try 1 or 2 and make sure I didn't do something stupid. Like in Georgia, that could create too much humidity in the colony possibly.
Exactly.
In your neighborhood, that's probably a non-issue. The bees like to keep their brood nest between 50 and 60% humidity. And I'm guessing your humidity these days is like 5 or 10% or something.
About 20. Maybe it's
really
like 20% maybe.
Oh, maybe you have some influence from the valley where there's a lot
from the
of
Delta, maybe.
Yeah. I know a fun side story here. I was in Riverside, California a couple of years ago at which is close to where I grew up. I grew up in LA County, and we were out there at a family reunion, and my wife's brother said, it was October, it was 101, and we were all sitting around sweating. He said, man, it's humid here. And I thought, this ain't humidity. I know better than that. So I got out my phone app and looked up Riverside. It was 7% humidity in October, So definitely different in your neighborhood.
Very, 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 very.
We wake up to 90 to 100% humidity 9 out of 10 days.
Wow.
By the midday, it settles down to about 50%.
Oh my
So we
goodness.
do a lot of sweating in the summer just because of the humidity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and here's another kind of weather related question, but maybe the opposite spectrum. Have in your beekeeping experience, have you ever had to protect or insulate hives in areas that get snow and get really cold during the winter? Or would you have any recommendations about something like that?
Well, I would recommend that something needs to be done, but I have to admit that I've never done it because I've never overwintered bees in the north. Although it snows where I'm at, and you know, a number of times every winter, we don't get really frigid weather that sticks around. Like it's very, very rare for it to get below zero here, like maybe once in 15 years. We see single digits in the winter 1 or 2 times most winters, but it doesn't last more than a couple days. You know, a 20-degree day is a cold day for us. So I don't have any experience with having to worry about that. If I lived in Minnesota, I think I'd have to do something. Uh, what we do, I'll tell you what we have a problem here with, and that is whenever we get cold weather, like down in the single digits or even the teens, it's because we're getting an Arctic blast from the north by northwest. So I try to set my bees up with a windbreak to the north by northwest so they don't get hammered with that wind when it comes in real cold. They can handle the temperatures are one thing, the wind's one thing, but when you put them together, it can be pretty nasty. So I just try to keep my bees out of the wind when possible. I have 42 bee yards and probably 6 or 8 of them do not have a windbreak, but the rest do. We try if we can. As you all know, it's not always, you know, there's such a thing as an ideal bee yards, but having all ideal bee yards, that's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, and there was a question also about the timing, and we know that all beekeeping is local, right? That's always what we
Sure,
hear and what we
yeah.
do. But when we talk about the beekeeping year and when it starts, it's interesting to kind of see the differences, you know, where we are compared to where you are. But even where we are, different parts of the valley, the bee seasons will be a little bit different. So those up in the foothills in the Placerville area, their season, their bee year is going to be a little bit different. But you have the benefit of having to beekeep in Oregon and then in other states. So what have you done? You know, how have you had to change things with your bee year? You know, even with the migratory, moving the bees around. How does that influence what you do with your bees just as a beekeeper? What do you have to consider?
Well,
That's a big question.
That seems like a simple question, but I'm stumped a little bit. Obviously, the southern locations are more forgiving, and you can beat the bees up more and not suffer many consequences. I have killed loads of bees. I killed a load of bees coming out of North Dakota once, killed an entire semi-load because it was cold, too cold. You know, beekeepers, you'll often read in the bee journals that it doesn't matter what the temperature is, that doesn't get too cold. That's not true. Once I hauled a load of bees out of North Dakota on a semi-truck into southern Oregon, and it was just brutally cold. I was working for another man, and I told him that I'd be glad to wait until the cold spell went away. You know, it was just super cold, below zero type of stuff. And driving across Montana, we had a headwind, which made it even worse. And I knew we were hurting them bees. I just knew it. And the man said, no, it's cool. Just, you know, it'll be okay. Just go. And when I got to Oregon, out of 360 colonies, only about 10 were still alive. And those were the ones that were right at the core of the load. Wow. That's not the answer to her question, I know, but you do have to be careful with temperatures and how you treat the bees. Back to too hot, too cold, you have to be sensitive. Have I changed my management at all? In Georgia, we have absolutely zero need to worry about water. It's everywhere. If I lived in Lodi, I think I would have to make sure there was some water nearby. Now, you guys might choose to put your bees in the shade. Here, that's a huge mistake, because when you put them in the shade, we suddenly have a terrible hive beetle problem. When the hive beetle larvae go out into the soil to pupate, they're much, much more prolific in a shady spot with deep soil than they are out in the full sun. So what I would have been able to get away with in your neighborhood, I can't do that here. When I came here 30 years ago, the first thing I did was try to put bees in the shade. It only took me about 2 or 3 years to figure out that that was a big mistake. And I also sought out and made sure water was nearby. I don't even think about it now because you can't go anywhere in our region where there isn't water within a quarter mile. And usually it's within a few hundred yards. There's creeks, they call them branches here. Out in
Branches.
Oregon, we would call them creeks or brooks. Just little
Oh.
rivulets of water. They're just absolutely everywhere here. Ponds and branches and creeks and rivers and stuff. So I don't worry about water. I do worry about the wind, where I might not worry about that in Northern California. You don't get those Arctic blasts, I don't think.
Yeah.
And what else would I pick on here? I can't think. She kind of stumped me. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. I think it's all about, I think that's the learning curve of beekeeping, is understanding where you are, where your bees are, and how that can change. And it might take you a couple of seasons to kind of figure it out. And even then it's going to have some variances, right? So
it absolutely does. Yeah. It took me a few years when I got here.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So if we have anybody here that might be moving towards the East Coast or towards the Tennessee region, what do you recommend people to bring their bees with them, or to purchase new bees in that new environment?
Either one is okay. You can bring bees out. They move well in the winter. Watch the weather forecast. And I just got through saying there is such a thing as too cold, but watch for cold weather. So, they'll stay in the colony. Or if you don't have a lot of colonies, if you just got 10 or 20, you can screen them. And if it's really even if it's warm, you can put a screen on the top and take the lid off, and you can get away with it. Either way it would work. You can buy bees readily here, but if you like your equipment and you like your bees, if it was me, I think I'd put them on the pickup truck and move them
Have a
with
trip.
the U-Haul trailer or whatever. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Well,
Do you have any
go ahead, Paul.
any Africanized honeybee concerns there in Georgia?
It's barely a concern in South Georgia, down on the Florida line. Where I live, it's of zero concern.
Because of cold.
They had one Africanized colony that they found in South Georgia, and they killed it and quarantined everything within 50 miles and looked and didn't find any others. And that was about 15 years ago, honestly. It was a long time ago. And when you get close to the Florida line, some of those guys down there have bees that just tend to be just a little more feisty. They will tell you they have no African, but that feistiness came from somewhere. But once you get up into middle Georgia and North Georgia, it's just non-existent. It's a non-issue. Tennessee for sure is pretty much African free. Now that doesn't mean somebody can't accidentally bring them up out of Florida on a truck or order queens from somebody who has some African genes, but there's something about the Africans that don't do well above, what is it, the 35th or 30, I think it's the 32nd parallel. You can bring them up, but they just don't do well, and eventually they just kind of dissipate.
So I'm thinking we just have a few more minutes. I'd like to give, do we have any questions that someone would like to just unmute themselves, and we'll go ahead and ask their question if they haven't put it in the chat? We have to remember that Bob is on the East Coast, so he's 3 hours ahead of us. He's graciously stayed up for us tonight.
Oh, it's all good. The good thing is I'll sleep good tonight. When I hit the pillow, I'll share a secret with you. I shouldn't do this, but I'm hiding. I'm in my bedroom. Right behind me is my bed. When I'm done talking with you, I'm going right over there.
Oh, that's great.
Lay down. I'm sure I'll go to sleep real easy. It's been fun though. I like talking with groups like you guys, and it's fun.
Well, we really appreciate it. And
Sure.
It was so great getting to know you and having you as our guest tonight. We value your time and your knowledge and your experience. So being able to share that with us was really great. So and
I'm going to contact you within the next week about what we were talking about earlier.
Yes,
And
yes.
appreciate your help on that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, okay, we all good? We all ready to go?
Yeah, I think so. So everybody, our next meeting is going to be on October 13th. And we really appreciate you being here. Definitely check out our Facebook page. And by all means, please make sure you go to Bob Binnie's YouTube channel tonight, subscribe, start going through all of his videos and information. And again, we really appreciate that you're here. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and do stop share, and I'm going to leave the meeting, and thank you very much.
All right. Have a great night. Thank
You
you,
too.
everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.